Good evening, everyone. My name's Andrew Pike. I'm honoured to be a patron of the Friends of the National Film and Sound Archive Association, and I've had a long involvement with the NFSA, including being a member with Professor Verhoeven of the original board of the NFSA as a statutory authority, which it became in 2008. Tonight we are on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and on behalf of the Friends of the NFSA, I'd like to acknowledge these communities and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands where we live, where we learn, where we work. And we offer our respect and gratitude to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to welcome here a number of people, interstate friends from Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, two other members of the original NFSA board, the 2008 board. I want to also acknowledge the presence of a current NFSA board member, Lucinda Brogden, here in the audience. I want to thank the management and staff of the NFSA who have contributed to the preparation of this event and have generously provided the venue to the Friends for this occasion. And particular thanks to the projection room staff for their technical support. I also need to acknowledge some absent friends and contributors to the history of the archive over the years. These friends wanted to be here tonight, but for reasons of age, health, distance, or conflicting obligations, they could not be here and have sent their apologies and messages of support. Alan Kerr, Chris Puplik, Murray Forrest, Ina Bertrand, Kim Dalton, Helen Musa, Ross Cooper, Martha and Sarah, Vincent O'Donnell, Sue Milligan, Mick Newnham, Sue Murray, Tom Ryan, Bob Hogg, Karen Foley, Jeff Gardner, Graham Shirley, Ken Berryman, nearly there, Victoria Rubinstein, Chris Harrison, Danielle Torsch, Michael Cordell, Philip Mortlock, Jill Matthews, David Elphick and Mike Linsky. Their individual roles and contributions are important and will be fleshed out in the printed record of tonight's event that you can find in due course on the Friends of the NFSA website. Now I'd like to call on Ray Edmondson as President of the Friends of the NFSA to speak about Rod Wallace and why we're holding this series of memorial lectures in his memory. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Roderick John Wallace, AM, is the godfather of the National Film and Sound Archive. He would not have called himself that and was typically embarrassed by public tributes to his achievements. But his pioneering work laid the foundations of the NFSA, its ethos, its skills, its sense of mission, and the scope of its collections. Without that foundation, none of us would be here tonight. Rod was one of the three original staff members of the National Library's new film division in 1945. Starting as a cataloguer, he rose to be head of the film division and later of all of the National Library's non-book collections, including maps, pictures, photographs, music and sound recordings, as well as films. In the 1950s, in his own time, he ran a search and rescue campaign to find and save early Australian films, and later to save the radio transcription and sound recordings made redundant by the arrival of television. In 1972, he established the library's first dedicated film and sound archiving staff units. Rod worked during the grim years of the cultural cringe, of a moribund feature film industry, of official and academic disregard of Australian creativity, and of the historic and artistic value of the audiovisual media. The economics of film preservation compared unfavourably with the cost of buying books. And Rod later recalled, "We were regarded as nuts and we were told so on many occasions. Some people said the films we collected should have been thrown on the tip." He handled the misgivings of National Library top management over the sheer quantity of disc recordings filling up the library's basement, many of them saved just in time from the aforementioned tip. Rod retired in 1977. The formal establishment of the NFSA in March 1984, 40 years ago this year, was, he said, one of the great moments of his life. So in this annual series, in Rod's honour, the Friends invite a notable personality to deliver a lecture of lasting import, which will be recorded and made permanently available to the public and contribute to the scholarship which underpins the NFSA and its purpose. Softly spoken, courteous, and with a disarming sense of humour, Rod was my boss during my own formative years in the National Library. He was to me, as to so many others, a mentor, a friend, and a fellow enthusiast. This lecture series reflects his optimism, his courage, his integrity, and his persistence, qualities which Rod would regard as essential to the work of all memory institutions.
Thank you, Ray. I had my own encounters with Rod Wallace, and I endorse everything Ray has said. He was an inspiring man to meet, and a big picture man who gave purpose to what ordinary mortals like me were doing when they stumbled into jobs at the film division of the National Library a long time ago. I remember him very dearly for the meetings he had with me at that time. Now I want to introduce Professor Deb Verhoeven, an old friend of mine, and she's been an outspoken defender of collecting institutions for much of her life. She served as the founding deputy chair of that original board of the NFSA when it became an independent statutory authority in 2008. She is currently working in Canada, holding the research chair in gender and cultural informatics at the University of Alberta. Prior to that, in Australia, she was Associate Dean of Engagement and Innovation at the University of Technology, Sydney, and before that, Professor of Media and Communication at Deakin University. In her career, she has served as a CEO of the Australian Film Institute and Director of the AFI's research collection at RMIT. As well as being a self-described stirrer, she is also a fantastic researcher and writer, absolutely prolific with over 200 items in her bibliography, including books and journal articles and books. So it gives me very great pleasure to introduce Deb to you, and I'm sure you're going to find this a very interesting and lively and stimulating and memorable lecture. And
no pressure.
No pressure. And when Deb is finished, we'll have a move over there for a brief conversation and questions from you. So think of questions as Deb is speaking.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Ray, and thank you to the Friends of the National Film and Sound Archive, and of course to the Archive for providing tonight's venue. Before I begin, I do want to acknowledge that I work on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis peoples in Canada, and also on the lands of the Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. Hands up, who went to the 40th party last night? Excellent. Keep your hand up if you were also at the 1984 party. A few people. You may remember what happened. It was an amazing event, I hear. I wasn't there. Apparently they had red carpet and celebrities arrived in limousines, and there was a wealth of personalities. There was a Prime Minister and a Prime Ministerial impersonator. So it was an event that had almost everything that you could wish for. What I want to do is play for you for a moment a speech from that event, because I think it tells us a lot about the story of the archive and the story that the archive tells itself.
This splendid evening has been put together to mark the permanent housing of a new kind of national institution, an institution devoted to the popular, cultural expression of our age and dedicated to the preservation of some of the best manifestations of Australian character and Australian imagination. And this is appropriately a night for light-hearted celebration, because we are dealing with media which are synonymous with entertainment, immediacy, and the stuff of our life and times and of our dreams. But our purpose is serious. The most popular and pervasive cultural phenomena of our time, moving images and sound recordings, are threatened. Not only do the laws of physics and of chemistry limit their lifespan, but there is also a widespread inclination to regard such material as expendable and of secondary value. To succumb to such thinking is to make a big mistake, I believe. Anyone with an historical sense would appreciate that a great deal, in fact, is bound up with the survival and with the accessibility of this major form of record and art characteristic of our century. Too much of this great national heritage has already been irretrievably lost. 95% of the silent films made in Australia before 1930 no longer survive. And to put a stop to such losses, the losses of these vital expressions of Australia's national creativity, the government has established the National Film and Sound Archive. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all obviously now at the beginning of an exciting venture, and I personally have much pleasure in declaring open this building as the permanent headquarters of the National Film and Sound Archive.
Bob Hawke speaks during the momentous occasion of the cutting of the ribbon of the independence of the National Film and Sound Archive as it was kind of removed from under the yoke of the National Library and given its own building, its own place, which we are in now. And he talks about this as a kind of a heroic journey, a journey that's a journey of survival against many perils. It's the victory of what he calls an historical sense, an historical sensibility of some kind. It's a victory of institutional permanence over attitudes of expendability, of continuation despite the chemical ravages of time, of finding and collecting over forgetting, of accessibility over loss, of independence and autonomy over civility, of dreams over disregard. And all of that is packed into a very tight, brief speech about this wonderful moment of the creation of the NFSA as the gift of posterity to entertainment immediacy and the stuff of our life and times and of our dreams. So the NFSA, to use his own words, would put a stop to losses. The NFSA's mission and vision was one of independence and of preservation, of taking something and giving it an historical sense. And what we're taking in his words are items or aspects of everyday Australian life. And these are really interesting concepts because they're not always concepts associated with the archive. They represent a kind of turning point in thinking about what's appropriate to have in archives. The story that Bob Hawke is telling in a way is a familiar story, and it's a story that we see told in lots of ways about this archive. It's the story of Tony Buckley's film Forgotten Cinema. It's the story of the National Film and Sound Archive's last film search. And it's also the story of the film search you have after you have the last film search, which they also did. The key emphasis in that story is the fight for and the eventual granting of independence to the NFSA with statutory authority in 2008, which Andrew and I played some small part in, as did Ray, for that matter. So I think this is a story that resonates in many accounts of the archive, not just Bob Hawke's. We see, for example, the idea that Next year represents the 90th anniversary of the archive. I'm a bit dubious about this myself. There was a cabinet note in 1935 establishing something that would involve the collecting of films. There's not necessarily a lot of evidence that those films remain collected or what happened to them. There was a meeting of an advisory committee, but we don't know much more than that. In 1957, the film division was proposed to be a separate organisation, but this proposal was rejected. In 1972, you have the creation of the National Film Archive within Film Collections and Services. These are all kinds of institutional histories about separation, division, keeping the archive in some way unique in terms of what it does and how it's identified. And as I said, culminating in this wonderful moment in 2008. I want to argue tonight that as comforting as this version of the NFSA's story might be, there are other, sometimes untold losses and forgotten threads in this particular telling. In telling a singular story that is so focused on independence, we miss the messy stories about interconnection and the alliances and relationships that were formed through this period with the archive. These are stories that lie between institutions, between people, between communities, even between formats: film, sound, documentation. Our sense of the archive is poorer for the absence of that story, of the story of those interrelationships. It affects what we think we can say about the archive and what it can say to us. And it affects how we give the rich, complex cinema lives of Australians a possible future. So what I want to talk about is precisely what this rather poetic sort of fragment of a wonderful book, The Jaguar, suggests. What lies beneath the thing is not the thing, but the memory of the thing. I want to talk about what constitutes, for most people who work with archives, but not necessarily in them, the memory of the thing. This image is kind of interesting to me because, it's on the front page of the National Film and Sound Archive website, so I'm sure you've seen it before. You kind of walked through it as you came to the cinema tonight. It reminds me of a snippet of a Godard film, which I cannot remember where I saw this, but in the film, Godard is having a conversation, I think it's probably with Goran, and they're talking about a picture of a factory. And one of them says, what do you think this is a picture of? And the respondent says, oh, well, it's a picture of a factory. And Godard says, no, it's not a picture of a factory, it's a picture of a building. Because if it were a picture of a factory, it would show you all the relationships that sit behind the facade of that building. It would show you the relationships of the workers and the employment relationships, the domestic relationships that people have outside the context of the building that they bring with them to work, and so on. And so I want to kind of think about that in terms of the way we start to talk about the archive, that we don't think about the archive in the way that Bob Hawke introduced to us as a place of separation, as a place with its own room and its own institutional identity, which is not to say those things weren't important, they are, but I want to kind of move through that story and start to tell some of the other stories. The idea of the archive goes back way before 1935. And I think we can understand the setting or the story of the National Film Archive through its early imaginings. In 1901, the Limelight Department was commissioned to record some of the ceremonies around Federation. Those films were actually given to government and held somewhere. We don't know where. But they certainly were part of that early sense of what the history of the archive could be. So a National Film and Sound Archive existed in the public imagination long before it was realised. The Hawke clip itself is precisely the kind of thing that might have been imagined to live or exist in this archive, because the archive that was imagined at the turn of the last century was an archive of significant historical events. That's what people thought should be in an archive. So you have in this 1909 article a world imagined in which books and newspapers would be surpassed by what were called voice photographs, which would put on record beyond all argument exactly who said what and what they said. This 1910 article just above me reports on calls for the establishment of film libraries or kinematographic departments in museums to house recordings of national events. These pictorial records of eventful occasions might very well be preserved for the edification and education of future generations based on a call for, and this is a quote from the article, a new departure for the usefulness of museums initiated by preserving for future generations of films the late King's funeral. So it would be things of royal significance that would go into this film archive. 1911, we get reports that the Paris Municipal Council had been thinking through the establishment of an archive. And that archive would contain the words and the sites of great men and notable events of today. Various attempts to establish this museum had failed, private attempts, but that they were looking at the establishment of government-subsidised film archives. The 1911 article above me, just there, is talking about establishing a department through Pathé Frères, which would be a national library of films which schools could use for free. In 1914, we see again articles about the idea that if you imagined thinking forwards, there would be a picture of a school of the future completely without teachers, but equipped with cinematographs and phonographs. And teachers themselves would blossom into actors before the cinematograph machine. It is further announced that provided 250 to 300 schools intimate their willingness to use films, a special education film library will be established in Australia dealing with Australian subjects. These subjects would include Burrinjuck, Yanco, a western river in flood, crossing the black soil plains, ploughing by traction engine, sheep shearing, gold mining, timber getting. And there are only a few of the subjects which lend themselves to educational film. 1916, we have a Punch article also talking about the idea of the establishment of home film libraries. Another article called The First Film Library, which says, perhaps at some distant time, the historian in search of first-hand knowledge of the events of the past will go to a national film library and ask to have certain films, the contents of which he has learned from a card index, shown to him in the theatre, which will be a necessary part of the library. Another one in 1917 called Historic Films. Is anything being done in this country to preserve films of national and historical interest for the benefit of future generations? Will our descendants be able to witness the various phases of the titanic struggle now in progress, or the enthralling incidents of the Scott expedition, or the state functions, representations of social life, performances of great actors and so forth, which may be seen in any picture palace today? There is no national department, as there should be, in which a copy of every important film is stored for future use. That we shall have it eventually is unquestionable, so why not have it now? Every day, lost posterity will owe us a grudge. Okay, I want to draw attention to two articles that I haven't scanned through very quickly. The first is this 1911 article, which is often talked about in relation to the history of the archive. This is a piece from Lone Hand about J.D. Williams. Right at the end of this article, says quite definitively, it is the duty of the government to establish an historical department which would work to secure films of the greatest events of our time for the benefit and interest of those who come after us. A pretty, I think, assertive imagining of a national film archive at that point, 1911. This article, though, is my favourite. This is an article by Adam McKay, and he says right up front, this article is written to convey the proposition, should not films of conspicuous historical value like these be permanently preserved by government in a public library, or rather public repository, to be overhauled at sufficiently frequent intervals in order that future generations may be eyewitnesses of the events which are happening in the world today. And he uses science fiction to try and imagine a future world which would benefit from this film repository that he's proposing. So he casts forward 400 years to a scene in Thirroul where we meet a future historian who will be teaching their children about these great events from 1916. I find this slightly ironic because Thirroul, which is in Wollongong, is the place at the moment of massive university cuts to the history department. So there, in 200 years' time, it's highly unlikely to be a historian in Thirroul if the University of Wollongong gets its way. So he didn't quite get that bit of the picture right. But some of the other things he predicts are really interesting. He predicts the uptake of film and video in people's domestic circumstances. He predicts the digitisation of text and so on. It's a really lovely piece of writing. He says, films will give a vividness to history in the future. And his ambitions are global, not just about Australia. Rather unfortunately, he cites Birth of a Nation as the most exemplary film he can think of for collection. Again, not quite thinking about historic legacies there, but anyway. And the one paragraph that I really want to draw attention to is this one. This is the paragraph about the name of such a repository. He's very keen to come up with a special name. He says, "So certain is the future that I believe the only necessary preliminary to the immediate formation of a national film library is the invention of a suitable name for it. A national filmery? The public screenery? Those are coarse names, banal and ugly. Can any reader think of a proper title? If so, let him speak up, and for he will forever have the honour of being the founder of a new system of national records." So the key features, that is, of course, all the various names. I took this from Ray's wonderful manuscript, which you'll see here, which also does talk about screen sound. But this is the kind of pre-1984 naming of the library. So you can see that naming was a kind of critical thing for this. And I think Adam McKay was actually onto something there. There are various common themes across these articles. Typically, government or military activity is considered the basis for a definition of what constitutes historical. There's an ethnographic impulse to preserving a present that is passing. And of course, it ties in quite neatly with certain ideas around eugenics, which were very popular at the time, the idea that cultures were passing, history is passing, these things need to be preserved. The urgency of the initiative being driven by a kind of competitive nationalism. Other countries are doing this, therefore we should do this as well. The struggle for a name, library, repository, archive, and so on, filmery, screenery. A really interesting thing going on around books versus films. A lot of the articles predict that film viewing will overtake reading, both for education, pleasure, and record keeping. And I find this very interesting, and it really does inform some of the histories we hear around the archive once it ends up in the National Library. And there's this kind of interesting frisson between books and audiovisual materials, part of which is about institutional identity and some of which I think precedes those things even being institutionalised. The belief that institutions, by their very notionality, are durable. This belief that if we have a public record-keeping facility or a repository, it will last. We just have to set one up. As the CEO of the AFI at a time when it was structurally defunded, and the broader structural reforms that were undertaken in the 90s and early 2000s by the AFC, I think this narrative about institutional durability is an interesting assumption. The belief that the underlying values that inform ideas about historical significance will be constant. This idea that they know what it means to be historically significant, and that will just always continue to be the same thing, whatever they decided it was. You know, people, politicians, military things, that would always be the definition of historicity. The very idea that a future archive lends itself to utopian science fiction in the face of perhaps a contemporary dystopia. So a lot of the calls for an archive arise during World War I, and things are not going so well in World War I. So there's a kind of an apocalyptic thinking at the base of some of this establishment of an archive. But what's really, I think, most notable, particularly about the Adam McKay article, is the concerted argument for the significance of the contemporary. And that's a big shift, because up until then, archives were very much focused on containing things from the past, significant things. So shifting to thinking about the value of the contemporary in an archive is huge. And it's a massive swing. And unless you have that conceptual shift, you can't start to think about creating film libraries. And so where does that come from, that idea that the contemporary suddenly becomes interesting? I'm going to play a little clip of an oral history that Ray did with Rod Wallace, where he talks about his own confusions about what is significant in terms of the historical and the contemporary.
Which came into the library I think it was weekly, it must have been weekly. They came in weekly. I was to go through this and produce a list of items of historical interest. Now, nobody said what historical was, and at first I thought, oh yeah, I'll just go through. If the Premier's opening a school or something like that, that'll be historical. But after a while I got worried myself, and I went and saw Mr. White, as he was then, and I said, I'm not clear what historical is. And he said, important things. One of which was librarians opening things and so on. But that was what I had to do. And you missed out on anything sport, that wasn't in it. Sporting stuff wasn't in it. Fashions, which they often had in those newsreels, that was definitely not supposed to be kept. So you just stuck to important people doing things. And they cost £3.10 an item, I remember. I don't know how many of those we eventually got. Because what happened there was that after a while, the Commonwealth Film Unit started up, or took over from the Department of Information, and they started producing Australian diaries. And Harold White himself says it too now. He thought that the Australian diary would take over the historical purpose that could be found in the newsreel. So he abandoned that business of getting copies of the newsreel. Well, it obviously doesn't matter now because they've got the masters anyway. But that was the very first historical kind of work that we did.
It's a great clip, and it tells you a lot about how a lot of decision-making and some of the principles underlying the idea of an historical collection or a national film archive built around historical material was really decided on the fly, or decided in ways that reflected the experiences of people who were more familiar with, say, books than they might have been with the filmed record. Where did that idea come from, though, this idea that we should be capturing contemporary events and that they should be somehow significant? And in part it comes from, I think in the Australian context, reportage around this particular organisation, the Modern Historic Records Association. They're an American organisation. They attracted significant interest from terrifically important people, Edison, American presidents, Carnegie, Dewey, famously of the Dewey Decimal System. Quite a number of people were involved in this organisation. They were an organisation that was committed to the belief that archival artefacts could be shared with the future. And so they created what we would now call time capsules or time vessels. And they would find materials, capture them, often in quite inventive formats. They were often looking for new ways of trying to create durable artefacts. And they would put them into containers, sometimes concrete them in and seal them, and then hope that they would be opened at some much later date in the future. Some of their time vessels have in fact now been opened by the New York Public Library. They're over 100 years old, so they've been given permission to open them. Many were lost. And of course this started a craze and it eventually did also come to Australia sometime later. But these particular events going on in America were reported here in Australia through the newspapers. In this context, what the Modern Historic Records Association were doing was perpetuating through notions of science fiction, fantastical futures which would be able to read these amazing records that we were capturing in the present on the latest state-of-the-art technologies, including film. And we've taken that idea of the catapulting out of context these things, what Rod Wallace calls in another part of the interview with Ray, that other stuff, the context. What we would call, I think now also, not just context, but possibly documentation or even metadata. And we would take that and push it into the purview of future historians. So we would be identifying in advance what would be of historical significance, what would future historians want to see, and would challenge, therefore, ideas about professional history and how professional history could be practiced. Because what you're basically saying is, instead of this heroic story of the historian cutting and scything their way through the jungle of documentation to locate the half-buried diamonds of their sources, time vessels would do all that for you. They would just package it all up and send it into the future, and you'd have some sort of ready-made sort of, fast food version of history for passive consumption. So time capsules also changed the idea around what historians needed or what historians could do or would want to do with these kinds of historical records that we were capturing. I want to talk briefly now about 3 major research platforms that arose precisely because national institutions such as the NFSA and Screen Australia, but not limited to them in any way, simply won't share or don't keep the information that researchers need to do their work. This is the Cinema and Audience Research Project database, which I built because I wanted to research cinema going, and I wanted to research specifically cinema going for Greek and Italian communities in Australia. In this data set, you can find a record of every Greek and Italian film screened in Australia in the mostly post-war period. You can also find a lot of other cinema screenings in here. Many researchers over time have added their data to this data set. You can see the histories of the cinemas themselves. It's all publicly available. It's downloadable. You can use this data in any format you wish. You can add to it. You can write to me and correct the record. It's intended to be a model for how we might think about describing the cinema in Australia in a different way to a catalogue. It arose because the National Film and Sound Archive catalogue itself was not interoperable, is not downloadable or reusable, does not include information about cinema screenings or cinema going or most other ways of approaching the study of film consumption. In this database, and there's many talks I could give on this particular database, we had to really rethink what a cinema itself was and how you would describe it in the terms of a data set. So data describing a cinema doesn't actually belong to that cinema. A cinema venue in this data set is constituted through the relationships of the data with other data. And so a very hard thing to describe, but take, for example, a cinema like the Valhalla in Melbourne. The Valhalla in Melbourne was a cinema that had a location and then it moved and it had another location. It also at various times changed business operators, it changed screening methodologies, it took on different programming techniques and so on. So all the things that you think are concrete about a cinema are not. How long does it take a cinema to die? When do we declare it finished or dead? Is it after 2 weeks of being dark? Is it after 2 months? What happens if it's revived 6 months later? The things that you think are durable descriptions of something like a cinema are not. They're all time dependent. So we had to change our database to actually reflect those changes themselves. So rather than a cinema being a place where events happen, a cinema in CARP is an event that produces places. It's a complete reversal of the typical way we might think about cataloguing something like a cinema. In the same way we might think about national cinemas. National cinemas are not simply defined by the production of films, they're inscribed in networks of people, places, practices and processes. An information approach, like the one that researchers who worked on this project with me take, is we approach the broader contexts and interrelationships that constitute all of our work in order to better understand the diversity of dreams for an archive. So we built this archive out of our dream for more diversity and for more capturing of those interrelationships. This is just an example of some of the lists of the screenings that you will find in CARP. And that's a picture of Pedi Yannoudas, one of the great Greek cinema entrepreneurs of Australia who passed away earlier this week. He's a remarkable man. He ran a multitude of cinemas, successful business operating Greek films to Australians, New Zealanders and South Africans, and even on into Canada and parts of the US. So he's a global distributor. He changed the face of Greek cinema, changing the way in which Greek films were made, provided remuneration back into the Greek production system through his cinemas. He screened Soviet films alongside Hollywood Westerns. He screened popular films from Holland, Eastern European films. He wasn't just limited or interested in Greek films, he was interested in popular cinema that was non-Hollywood. And if you go to the National Film and Sound Archive and search his name, how many records do you think there are for Peter Yannoutis in the NFSA catalogue? I can tell you, there's one. One record for a really extraordinary life and an extraordinary contributor to Australian cinema going. The research that we did based on some of those screenings produced early examples of geospatial mapping of cinemas in Australia, and because we could use the data and interoperate it with other data, we were able to get census records looking at where Greeks lived in Melbourne and then co-locating that data so we can see where the cinemas are and where the populations of Greek migrants lived. And we did that by census year. It all looks very interesting when you look at it like this. But if you animate it, like if you actually turn this into a movie, here we go. So as the yellows get darker and then turn into pinks, there's more Greeks living in those particular areas. And I've watched this about 7,000 times, so I'm going to cut to the chase. What this really amazing animation shows you is that the Greek cinemas came before the populations. So this is a very early example of if you build it, they will come. That cinema constitutes communities in a way, or calls communities into being. This is a data visualization also using the same data from CARP, which is showing you what happened to cinemas in the post-war period, which ones died, why they died, where they were when they died. So the cardinal points are effectively a map of Melbourne, north, south, east and west. The blue cinemas are Hoyt's cinemas. The red ones are Greater Union. We have many of these are called petal diagrams. They were kind of an invention of the project. But one of the things that you'll see in these visualizations is that if you were a Hoyt cinema within 20 kilometres of the CBD and you made no changes to your business during this period, you were 100% likely to fail and be shut down. So these are really interesting ways to do pattern analysis and try and identify what were the core factors or key factors that were motivating closures during a very volatile period in cinema exhibition. This is Sydney, just showing you again what was happening in relation to closures and openings. So a very big period of closures between 58 and 63, but then we have periods of rejuvenation as well. Okay, this data set is the Kinematics Australian Film Production data set. So not only do I have an interest in film consumption and cinema going, but I was struck that the record of Australian film production, including who worked on the films, is not publicly available. Screen Australia do provide you with a website that you can interact with, but you can't download the data and they won't share it. We asked. So we've just spent the last year building a data set that captures all Australian feature film productions and personnel from 1975 to 2022. We have made it publicly available. You can download it. You can do whatever you like with it. It's free and accessible. We spent a lot of time trying to ensure that we got, for example, capture people's name changes. So every unique person has a unique person identifier, and every film production has a unique film identifier. This sounds like, so what? What does that matter, these identifiers? This service is revolutionary for researchers because it provides us a means to distinguish filmmakers with identical or similar names, hello George Miller and Paul Hogan, and it also allows us to link these records to records in other systems which could also use the same identifiers. So we can actually see where these people are in the Australian Dictionary of Biography or in literature data sets or in the National Library. This was a service the National Library promised to deliver to Australia 20 years ago and never did. So this idea of having persistent, unique identifiers for creative people in Australia is brilliant and fantastic for future research. This is a gift to the future, just as much as preserving a film. We can do some analysis using this data set, and you see here some of the things that you can do with it. For example, we can look at when Australian film industry is predicted to have gender equity. Any guesses? I haven't put the dates at the bottom. It's not as bad as Canada. That was, I think, Canada is 2,654 or something. It's like not within anyone's living projection for even the planet. 2050, based on current projections, in the top 10 roles that we have. Here you can see just a very quick calculation of the number of films that people work on. And you can see that overall about 70% of people in the Australian film industry only ever work on one film, which is kind of interesting. It's actually consistent across most national cinemas I've studied. But what it means is if you're trying to create policies to intervene in the industry, for example, gender equity policies or anything like that, you have a lot of redundancy built into how your policies fold out because 70% of people just do the one film and then leave. Okay, the last project, this is just a little example as well of what you can do with this particular data set. So you can, if you're in the film industry, do a selfie, and if you're not, you can search for someone and then figure out all the people they worked with, how central they are to the network of the Australian film industry, and how interconnected they are, not just generally, but specifically. So you can find out how many steps it will take to get from Jane Campion to Baz Luhrmann, or from Jane Campion to Tony Ganane. It could be quite useful if you're actually trying to figure out how to meet someone. I'm not recommending it as a dating app, but you know, it has potential. So you can play around with the visualization and actually see all the people that exist around a person or worked in proximity to someone. Okay, the final platform I want to present before I move on toward the end of the lecture is this one, the Humanities Network Infrastructure, HONEY. HONEY was also built out of the frustration of researchers, a number of academic researchers who realised that we were all building these data sets like CARP and so on, and we were building them in isolation. And we wanted to actually collaborate and try and work out a way in which all our collections could be searched simultaneously. So rather than building our collections in isolation and thinking of them as silos, to try and think about how useful it would be for a researcher who might want to work across disciplines. Because people live across disciplines. Artists and creatives don't just confine themselves typically to one particular practice. So in a very divisive world, we felt that from our position of independent curators and collectors, that maybe now was time to begin the deep and important work of connection. And how would we do that? And so we built this humanities network infrastructure. We invited many of the collecting institutions in Australia to participate. Happily, the National Library was one of the participants, so you can search across the Trove newspaper collection in HONEY. IATSIS was another collection, the National Museum, Melbourne Museum, and so on. The National Film and Sound Archive declined to participate in this initiative, much to everybody's disappointment. There is a lot of cinema data in here. but it's typically cinema data that mostly I've collected. So this is what the landing page looks like. So this is just a very quick example of what you can do inside Honey. So you can use the search, or you can just go to find out what other people are working on. Here's my collection of Peter Weir. And what I was interested in was looking at Picnic at Hanging Rock, because Picnic at Hanging Rock is both something relevant to film, but also to literature. And so you can see that by tracking through what we call a graph, representation of all the connections between things, I can find all those interconnections. Again, this is all downloadable and shareable. All right. I think my fervent hope is that we don't just approach the importance of the film archive as a way of recording the search for national federation, but that we consider the value of cross-institutional or federated approaches to search. Catalogues and databases and discovery platforms are also historical. They have a kind of temporality. They are not forever. And part of what they do is organise things according to time, as I talked about when I was saying how we tried to capture data around cinemas in CARP. As historical artefacts themselves, they respond to and prompt our thinking about cinema and its significance, and they deserve to be collected. The focus on standalone buildings and institutional independence, on points of difference and pristine artefacts takes attention away from a different view of what archives can and might be. If you want to find out, for example, about Peter Weir's collaborations in the film industry and those that he developed across the course of his career, using the National Film and Sound Catalogue won't let you do that. You have to use the service I built. If you want to find out how Picnic at Hanging Rock played out in cinemas around Australia, you can't do that in the National Film and Sound Archive Catalogue. You have to go to one of the platforms I built, CARP. We can only do the research we do based on the information we have to hand. The resolute focus on the National Production Catalogue has resulted in limited research and understanding of the significance of cinema in Australia. So, this lovely cake tin, which you can actually see out in the gallery, was donated to the National Film and Sound Archive by Neil Daft in 1992, and it contained Captain Thunderbolt. There's a lovely story about it. I'm really interested in this cake tin. I've become a bit obsessed with it, as Jeff Ray, who was supporting my research on this talk, is well familiar with. I've been pestering him about this cake tin for some time. And it plays into this idea I have around the importance of consumption and the importance of an archival appetite for driving new knowledges about cinema and its value in Australia. My friend Mark Deutzer has a new book coming out, and at the beginning of that book, he talks about another book, a book by Wendell Berry called The Pleasures of Eating, which was originally published in 1989. And in The Pleasures of Eating, Berry says, it's really interesting how people forget what it takes to make food. And in their ignorance, they lose out on some of the pleasure of having a meal. And he compares our ignorance of the global industrial food system to the dependent and uncritical experience of the entertainment industries. He says, people don't think of themselves as participants in agriculture. They think of themselves as consumers. If they think beyond that, they recognise they are passive consumers. They buy what they want or what they've been persuaded to want within the limits of what they can get. They pay mostly without protest whatever they're charged, and they mostly ignore certain critical questions about the quality and the cost of what they are sold. His arguments remind me of how collecting institutions also imagine their audiences or publics as passive consumers of their institutional catalogues. Searching the National Film and Sound Archive catalogue is a bit like trying to take a look inside a cake tin. And there's a bit of an attitude of just let them eat cake. How can we help researchers and members of the public understand and even analyse the labour that goes into making an archive? What is the real cost, i.e. what do we lose, what are we missing when we search the catalogues of our collecting institutions? In an era of deep fakes, those very early arguments that we saw from the early newspapers for an archive that preserves films precisely because of their indexicality, their truthfulness, has never been more important. Keeping the facts in our artefacts is increasingly necessary. So I'm not arguing against any of that. The search for the significance of the present, for the value of the everyday, including the importance of audiovisual entertainment, is also as relevant now as it seemed 100 years ago during an earlier period of global violence in World War I. The utopian pursuit, such that the nation's chronicles will be delivered in audiovisual formats which will remain relevant and intact and will be readable in the future, is without a doubt a noble one. My concerns address how the archive understands the value and future potential of connectedness, that its sense of history can extend to a way of doing its work institutionally and at the core of its processes in good relations rather than in silos. Independence for the archive was fought for an extraordinary period of time. Many, many people worked diligently and tirelessly for that outcome. It is worthy of celebration. But as a researcher, as someone who makes a professional habit of searching, of identifying what is missing and figuring out how and where to find it, this independence is also an impediment and not one that is solved by delivering more results to an ever-expanding cake tin. So, here's what I'm looking for. National Film and Sound Archive. 1. Make your catalogue data available and open. We have been breathlessly waiting for an API for too long. For many of us, it's not just the thing, but the memory of the thing, the metadata, to quote the poem from the start of this show. That is what we're looking for. 2, bring the documentation collection into prominence. There is value in written words and not just audiovisual images. I appreciate the history and resentment towards books that comes from years and years of being yoked to the National Library. It's time to let go. It's time for the NFSA and other collecting institutions to engage the research community and deliver federated search. The idea for a national archive of film records in Australia began with federation. Let's honour that. And let's do it in ways that respect the independent and rich knowledges of each institutional collection. In other words, giving all your cake crumbs to Trove is not the answer. And yet, Trove does offer many lovely things. In this way, film and sound will truly take their place alongside the books and written documents of other collections. 4, treat your own information systems and processes as an artefact of significance. Not providing the history of your own institution at the level of the collecting itself is a form of historical denialism. How can we address the eugenics at the heart of our archives and collections if we don't see these practices as something to be preserved for examination? We want to see cataloguing histories, we want to see code versions, we want to see your collection policies, date and time stamping, point-in-time views, all of those things. 5, personally, I would like to see the creative information platforms and infrastructures developed by researchers such as myself to compensate for the limitations of the archival search to become themselves collection artefacts and perhaps even services. The opportunity is there. They are my asks. In this way, I truly hope the NFSA will live up to the dream identified in the preamble to the Time in Our Hands Charter, which says, the National Film and Sound Archive represents and expresses the cultural significance and distinct character of the screen and sound media in Australian life. We're not there yet. Thank you.
Oh, look, wonderful.
Can you do a Bob Hawke impersonation? Can you do a Bob Hawke impersonation? I failed.
I think that when you were talking, gave that example of the time capsules being sent to the moon and to Mars. In a way, the artefacts that are here in this NFSA are like thousands and thousands of time capsules. And we can physically open and look at them, but what sense do we make of them? We don't know how to make sense of them entirely. We make some sense, but is that the only sense we can make of them? And we need more brain power applied to get that understanding out of these artefacts that are in this archive and are being so lovingly cared for. And we need the application of historical sensibility, as Bob Hawke called it, to open up these artefacts, these canisters, to get to the riches that are inside. And one way to do this, Deb, when we were on that original board, we had all sorts of ideas at that time about the NFSA commissioning journal articles, publishing a journal for academic studies to encourage analysis of the films in the collection. We were wanting to stimulate the study of Australian cinema history at universities around Australia, and so on and so on. Well, in the years that have followed, Australian cinema studies at universities
has declined.
Have declined is the polite term, yes?
Yeah.
They've died, and the historians who know about the history, early history of Australian cinema in depth, are now retired or getting elderly or rambling like me. You know, we need to stimulate new people to study.
Well, there's a fundamental challenge there, Andrew, and one of the reasons I stopped teaching Australian cinema is because it was impossible to see the films.
This is precisely the point.
So we can see crumbs, bits of the cake on the ASO website. We're offered little clips of different films, but if I want to teach the whole film, I have to hope that someone has uploaded it to YouTube illegally. And then I don't formally tell my students where to find it, but they can work it out themselves. And so, for example, this brings up another whole can of worms, but if I wanted to teach the films I wrote my PhD on, which were films like Squatter's Daughter, there is, 3 clips in ASO, and then there's an illegal upload on YouTube. That's it.
So one of the things that we did raise back in those glory days of that first board was the idea that the NFSA should actively try to coordinate and encourage tertiary institutions to introduce courses in early Australian film history so that these canisters could be opened and examined appropriately. Not just for their for signs of chemical deterioration, but for what content is there. And instead of that being encouraged, the reverse has happened, and those studies have gradually ceased to exist. And the historians are also heading for oblivion as well as we speak. Deb's a lot younger, so there's a lot more ahead for her. But anyway, that's just one point for thought. So should we hear what you all think about this in the audience? Anyone with questions? Over here, Michael Organ. Wait for the
Okay, thanks for that, Deb. As a professional archivist and a historian, I'd just like to point out that the thing is the thing, and the role of the archives is to take care of the thing. Now, the role of the archives is also it's to protect, preserve and promote. And I think that's the big failing of most archives. They spend a lot of time protecting, finding stuff, preserving, taking care of it, digitising, cataloguing, all that sort of thing. But they fall down in regards to promotion, and that's what we're talking about here. You can't you can't get access. If you want to find a film, you've got to go to YouTube. You've got to find things like that, like Sentimental Bloke and For the Term of His Natural Life, all being digitised, all being restored, but not available anywhere for anyone. So I think it's going to be up to people like you, people like the historians. It's not necessarily going to be up to the archivists. They've got to be forced. They've got to be told that you've done all this great work, but you have to do the third part, which is promoting, selling yourselves, return on investment, all those sort of things. So I ask you, are you going to tomorrow send your 5 points to Patrick?
I'm going to record it and then put it in a time capsule. I'm going to slightly disagree with you. The thing doesn't always have to be a material object. So even the NFSA Charter in Time in Our Hands says the moving image and recorded sound heritage of Australia shall include, but not be limited to, the following: moving images and or recorded sounds created or released in Australia or by Australians or with relevance to Australians, right? Much broader than any collection policy I've ever seen this institution have. Objects, materials, works, and intangibles, okay, relating to the moving image and recorded sound media. And I think that's really important because we have become very focused on the objects for good reason. I'm not saying that should not have happened. I'm saying in addition to that, we've lost some of the rest of it. So it's the intangibles that I'm fascinated with. And they're also a different perspective would, and we don't have to go quantum here, but underneath every object is a lot of intangible and around it and within it. And I think that a lot of archivists now are rethinking that idea of what an object really is anymore. And that's why I also say cataloguing systems are now an artefact or an object. They can tell us a lot about something. So I kind of think we need to expand both our definition of the object, but also think outside the object as well.
Someone else out there with a question or a comment? Yes, Gino, down here in the front. Could you say who you are, Gino, when you start?
Gino Moliterno. I was teaching film studies here at the ANU until I retired about 10 years ago. And in fact, that's I just wanted to follow up on what Andrew was saying. I'm not quite sure what it is that or how I want to put this, but one of the problems with film studies going down in all the universities affected us quite deeply when the NFSA got rid of those 35 people in 2014, I think it was. And in terms of these time capsules that are here, tangible or intangible, but for work to be done here to sort of bring out the significance of the material that's here, we had a really good arrangement, being the ANU and next door, here, that we had a really good arrangements for our honours students to spend one semester up here. And I remember and they would have a project to do, and the project was to be instructed in archival, how to carry out archival tasks. And over, it didn't last long, because then, in fact, it fell apart because there was so much there were so many financial problems here, and the staff changed. Eventually the really important staff, Quentin and Graham Shirley and so on, all left. But before that, there was a period when, because it was changing after Paolo left, there were a couple of directors who weren't all that helpful. And I mean, to say that for about 2 or 3 years, the academy, so to speak, the university was actually helping the NFSA to do what it couldn't do on its own, but also as a matter of linking up, as you were saying. But then it fell apart. And then the program, I mean, we couldn't send the honours students up here for a semester because the structure that we had built up for that actual collaboration just fell apart, and there weren't people to talk to anymore to try and work out how to have that going. So,
well, I think this is a good example of what I'm talking about, which is if we focus on how to be in good relation and make that the purpose as much as siloizing and time capsuling or whatever metaphor, cake tinning or whatever metaphor we want to use. But if we start to think about the relationality of the archive's relationships outside of itself, but also inside itself, what happens with knowledge transfer inside the organisation, as much as what happens to knowledge transfer outside of the organisation and into the organisation, right? So, the multifarious and multivalent ways in which you can have great relationships is important. But if we're not focused on that, then they won't be durable and they won't survive because they have to be nurtured.
Yeah, I think when I think of it, that was also the period when all institutions, including the ANU and, of course, the NFSA, were being encouraged to actually to have collaborations. I mean, it was part of the sort of government policy at the time. And so, we set it up and it worked for a bit, but then it fell apart.
We have 5 minutes left. We have 5 minutes.
Another quick question. Yes, up the back.
Hi, Martin Jolly. I agree with everything you've said, and I understand your...
I don't pay him.
I understand your interest in cinema going as a cultural practice, but it just made me think that now, in 2024, cinema going isn't a thing. People stay at home and play games with each other, dispersed internationally. So media is now more and more performed in a particular moment between people who are online, which just puts more pressure on archives to somehow capture this moment of media production and consumption, which is far more difficult than the moment of going to a Greek cinema in Melbourne in 1950s, but not dissimilar. So obviously you've thought about this. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
There are many thoughts on what we do with the contemporary record now, right? So when you think about what was going on in those early newspaper articles from 1911 and 1909, where they're saying, let's use this new technology not just to create durable records, but to be part of our sense of what's important and significant itself, right? I think we're facing that same discussion, or have been now for some time, but definitely now, about what we do with the new technologies that are part of people's everyday lives. And we have to decide what's significant about those as well. I have many personal attitudes and beliefs around stuff to do with the information oversupply, which we have now, rather than what you might have had in an earlier period of archiving, which was precarity. So the early arguments for we have to find these missing things, these fragments, and gather them all up and preserve them and put them in a cake tin, or a very big cake tin. And now we have the opposite, which is everything's overflowing, and how do we make sense of it, and how do we get to the bits that are actually going to be significant for the future? That is a whole different set of problems. So we see lots of different approaches to creating those solutions. Some of those involve crowdsourcing, involving the public more in the selection process. AI would be another obvious way of thinking about this. So selecting materials around certain curatorial principles using machines, because most of this material is machine readable. There are many, many different ways in which archives are approaching this problem. And I leave that to the archivists, which I must admit I am not.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we do have to finish there or we'll be in big trouble. So would you join me in thanking Deb for a fantastic lecture? And
thanks, everyone, for coming.
And the lecture has been recorded, and a transcript and the recording will be available soon on the Friends of the NFSA website. So you can pursue it there and dig into that time capsule again when you get a chance, and encourage others to do that too. So thank you all for coming. And I would ask, on behalf of the archive staff who are getting edgy outside, we all need to leave reasonably promptly. But we can talk in the foyer and in the courtyard. Thank you.
Doesn't matter how you back it up, it's better to leave while you're in love. Even though we're not together, I can't seem to change.